Hello everyone, it's Friedemann Findeisen from Holistic Songwriting, and welcome to another podcast. Today I have a surprise for you because I'm not alone here. I have someone with me, and that will be the YouTuber 12 Tone. Hello there.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I've been following you a while on YouTube, and I really love your stuff, which is why I got in touch with you, because I really wanted to do something like this. You do sort of like music theory, classes on YouTube. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, we do a bunch of different things. We talk sometimes about scales or harmony. We also talk about textures and just whatever I happen to be interested in that week. Every month we do a series called Building Blocks. It's sort of more basic stuff that we start with like what's a note and then like what's a chord and what's a scale and then build up. We're into like functional harmony and stuff like that now. We also every month at the first week of the month do a song analysis, like a harmonic analysis of a popular song. We just did Comfortably Numb. We've done Blackbird. We've done Stairway to Heaven. And yeah, pretty much stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah, and I really love your stuff. I mean, I've been following you for a while, and I can't say that about a lot of music-related YouTube channels. So I really like it. It's really good fun, and it goes very in depth. So I really like your stuff.
Thank you. Today,
we're going to talk about music theory, and hopefully we can make more episodes like this in the future. But this one is kind of going to be about tonal harmony and what is it good for? What is music theory in general? So my first question would be to you, what is music theory?
It's a complicated question, but I think the definition I like is that music theory is an attempt to systematically understand the underlying structures of a musical culture, which basically means like...
That was so Wikipedia of you. That was great. I love that. That's
actually,
amazing.
I do like the definition they have on Wikipedia.
It's great.
If I can pull that up. But it's, here it is. They say it's a sphere of research that can be distinguished from analysis in that it takes as its starting point not the individual work or performance, but the fundamental materials from which it is built, which is, they're quoting from the Oxford Companion to Music. So this is high-level dictionary stuff.
Jesus. Okay, I like yours better.
But yeah, it's just, I think it's trying to understand not just what music is at a surface level, but how different parts of it connect. It's trying to sort of abstract ideas like we know D7 sounds good going to G major and C7 sounds good going to F major. And you can look at that and be like, is there a connection there? Are those related? And of course they are. It's the 5 going to the 1 in both cases. And trying to take stuff like that and build that into more complex theories that help describe how, like maybe how secondary dominants work, how tritone substitution. I'm getting into some complex terms. They're not super important, but it's sort of trying to take simple ideas and say, what does this actually tell us and what can we do with it? And that's, I think, what music theory is about to me.
It took me a really long time to figure out that there's other types of music theory, like the one that I was taught in, 2 different conservatories and at school and in music theory books was always functional harmony. But there's so many other schools of music theory out there. I mean, I took a class on raga music, which is like the Indian classical music theory, which is really interesting as well. Like how they approach writing melody is so fascinating because they don't really have harmony, right? They have one drone underneath everything and a certain groove. And then the way they write melodies is super interesting. But there's also other sort of Western music theories out there. And would you like to talk about those really quickly and how they like broadly differ from the one that we know, functional harmony?
Sure. So, functional harmony is, it's the idea that different chords in a key have different jobs, just in case anyone doesn't know. So you sort of break it into, there's a bunch of different things, but you break it into 3 main types that are basically chords that feel at rest, chords that feel a little unstable, and then chords that are really unstable and point you back to the chords that feel at rest. That's a real quick rundown of functional harmony. But there's a lot of other techniques are based on voice leading, which is sort of how different notes move in between chords. And the biggest one of those that I'm familiar with and that I'm a huge fan of and I really like is Neo-Riemannian analysis. So if you take a major triad, there are 3 different minor triads that share 2 notes in common with it. So if you have, say, F major, there's, of course, F minor, which also has F and C. But there's also D minor, which has the same F and A, and then A minor, which has A and C. And then you can sort of say that those 3 minor triads are related back to that major triad. And so you can sort of transform in between them very smoothly. And then each minor triad is then itself associated with three major triads, and you can sort of see how closely connected two chords are by seeing how many of these different transformations you have to apply. So if you wanted to go from, say, F major to C major, you would have to go from F major to A minor, and then A minor goes to C major, and each of those is one transformation.
Yeah, so it's all about the voice leading. It's about connecting the chords as smoothly as possible. It's not necessarily like the way we're used to it in functional harmony, where everything is in one key, but it's about like just every single transition is as smooth as possible. So it like just one note is going to change between every two chords. Is the basic idea behind it. Yeah, I first heard about this at a conference for film musicians, like film composers, and I'd never heard of it before. And that guy wrote a lot of his scores using that approach, and I find it really fascinating, especially if you're writing background music, something that's not supposed to like stand out as much. If you do something like that, which sounds, it does sound very tense in some ways because we're not really used to that sound of having a lot of, out of key chords. But it's a super fascinating approach, because if you do that a lot, and if that is your sound, where you constantly have that tension of like, you never know what the next chord is really going to be in that way.
Yeah, where it's going to come from.
Exactly. Yeah. That if you do that a lot, then it becomes a sound of its own. And if you put that in the background of a scene, it's really interesting what that does to a scene. It's a really, really cool effect in film music. I don't know. Have you ever written for film as well?
I haven't written for film. I've done some work on just like, I haven't written background music. I've done like introduction, like theme music stuff, but I haven't done sort of underscoring very much. But one thing that I did want to bring up about, because you were saying, if you use this enough, it sort of becomes a sound of its own. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize about music in general, is that basically everything that we think about in terms of how music sounds is culturally based. It's based on what we grew up with, what we're used to hearing. And if you look at other musical cultures around the world, like you were mentioning Indian classical music, they don't really have harmony. If you look at like gamelan orchestras, they're primarily rhythmic. If you look at like any number of things, you'll see basically every assumption we have about how music works at a deep level, some culture out there has built a completely different system. So in any sort of music theory, you have to ask, what musical culture am I talking about? What am I trying to examine, and what am I trying to explain before any sort of theories become useful or pointful?
Yeah, absolutely. And it even differs between different genres. Like if you show a pop song to a jazz professor, he's going to have a very different ear for everything than someone who's like new to jazz or something like that. We all have our history, of course, of what we can listen to. And like if you're into modern classical music, we're probably going to be hearing things a lot differently than if we only listen to pop music.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree.
Okay, so we really quickly talked about Neo-Riemannian theory, and there's Schenkerian music as well, right? The Schenkerian music theory.
Yeah, so that's one that I don't have a huge background in. My understanding of it is it's basically trying to boil down complex music into its fundamental elements, and sort of say, okay, you have this complex melody, and you say, okay, this is the real melody, and then these other notes that are part of it are just their decorations. And then you get a simpler version, and you can sort of then take that and do the same thing and say which of this real melody is the decorations at that level, and you can keep moving forward like that. And you can do the same thing with harmony and say like what is like fundamentally you have like a 1-5-1, but you threw a 4 in there as a decoration, so now it's 1-4-5-1, and then you threw a 6, and then it's just 1-4-5-6-1 or something. Yeah, you can sort of say, okay, but fundamentally what's happening here is 1-5-1 with decorations. And you can do the same with melodies. And that's sort of, like I said, I haven't done a lot of Schenkerian analysis, so I don't want to go too deep into it because I'll probably get things wrong. But like that's my basic understanding of it, is that it's trying to boil complex composition down into what its real form is, and what parts of it are just ornamentation and decoration.
Yeah, that's what I gathered from it as well. I mean, I just read like a couple of Wikipedia pages on it, but that's what I gathered from it as well. And what I use from it is the ersatz, like that's what you're talking about, is that basic version of melodies in my case. Like I use it for melodies a lot, actually, where I think of like, okay, these are like my core melody notes. Like those are important. Those are hitting those are on the on beat usually, or they're like held for a long time. So those are my key notes, and everything else is just embellishment. So I think about that a lot when I write music, like melodies in general. All right, cool. I think we covered it. I think we can move on to the next one, which is music theory still useful? Because me personally, I have a love-hate relationship with music theory. And I do really like music theory, but it's more like a Sudoku kind of love, where it's, for me, it's like a fun riddle. Like I love toying around with numbers, and that stuff is fun to me. I always loved maths in school, so that was always fun for me. But I have a problem with music theory in music to a certain degree, because I can't stand it when songwriters fit just one more dominant chain into their already complex chord progression to show how much they know, you know? And I hate it when I hear choices that are clearly motivated by someone's ego. Because the way I see it, songwriting is not about you. Songwriting is about the song, and all songs are essentially a means of communication. So when Adele sings about her lost love, she's really talking to everyone who's been through the same thing, telling them, it's okay, we've all been there. Some of us just win more Grammys while doing it. So when we hear The Weeknd talking about money and bitches, that's speaking to the minds of the many who want a life like that, I think. So I think if music is communication, why would we then use grammar, music theory, to complicate it, to make sure only very few people understand us? Using music theory when it's not called for, to me, is like using the word, au courant when you mean contemporary. That's how I feel when I hear unnecessary moves in songwriting. I mean, I get what you mean, but why didn't you just say this?
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think there's the way I think about it is there's times when like simple words don't suffice. When you have to use something complicated because the words don't exist at the basic level. But I've definitely seen a lot of people who are just like doing complicated things to show that they know how to do complicated things in a way that works.
Exactly.
And that often, in my opinion, and of course all of this is subjective, like it may work really well for them. In my opinion, I don't tend to like that very much. I tend to prefer simple stuff. I think that one thing that I think music theory really helps with in terms of this sort of thing is when I was in college, I had a professor who talked about a principle in pop music and rock music that he called one messed up thing. So basically, there's a lot of rules about how to make a pop song, how to make a rock song that are all really pretty straightforward. You don't do a lot of complicated stuff, but if you follow all those rules, then you just have something really generic that sounds like every other pop song. So you try and find like one thing, like one interesting thing that you can sort of vary and just build around that, and that gives your song some identity without making it too complicated. But you're not like necessarily trying to string together like a tritone substitution into a secondary dominant that resolves to the I can't even make up all that gibberish right now, but you know what I mean. Yeah. It's not like not trying to do this super complicated chain of things, but you still have something that makes your song stand out. Like maybe it's a chromatic mediant in your harmony that like you wouldn't necessarily think to put, but you just have this slightly different chord that you wouldn't expect to hear that helps to convey your message. So that's I think where it comes in, is used carefully, and I wouldn't say necessarily sparingly, but like not to show off.
Right. Have like one thing per project, and then have that consistently throughout their project. I've been watching this really cool Netflix series called Abstract. I think it's called The Art of Design is like the subtitle. It's super cool if you haven't seen it. The first episode especially, because it's a German guy, so obviously it's cool. And I thought the first episode was absolutely amazing. And he has this one thing where like he's a painter and he draws for the Times, New York Magazine or something like that. Like he does the covers for those magazines. And there's one bit where he goes, with every project that I do, I just do like this one brush stroke like across the paper, and like to ruin my painting, just to force me to rethink my process. Because he says, like, as much as I'm an analytical person, so as much as I'd like to break this down into formulas, I really can't, because there's always an element of surprise, and that has to be there for it in order for it to be truly magical and to have that certain something. And I completely agree with what you're saying in that regard. Really, you need every project, you should do something that scares you and then make it work. Because that's how we, I think, evolve. That's how we make our songs sound interesting. That's how we stand out as artists. And that's how we can really, truly find our style, I think.
Yeah. And I think there's a great quote that relates to design, and I can't remember the name of the person it's from, but basically a designer's job isn't done when there's nothing left to add, it's done when there's nothing left to remove.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good way to think about songwriting too, is, are you throwing in a horn line because it needs a horn line, because that horn line helps say something, or are you throwing in a horn line because you know how to arrange a horn line over this harmony? Like, does the song need a horn line, or do you want a horn line?
Exactly.
For whatever value of horn line you might choose.
Yeah, I always find it really interesting when people talk about pop music as if it was this like super simplified thing, and it's just like, oh, pop music is so simple, but no one ever complains about the Apple logo being too simple, And to me, it's like, oh, that's the same thing, exactly what you're saying. Like, it's perfect when there's nothing left to take away.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if you look at pop music, like the harmony is often not that complicated. It's often four chords, not four songs, four chords over and over again. But if you look at the arrangement, if you look at like the logic file that it's stored in or whatever, there's could be like 100, 200 tracks. There's all sorts of things that are layered in there that help bring the song to life in ways that aren't necessarily harmonically complicated or melodically complicated, but still matter and still make it feel different.
Yeah.
And add a lot of value, even if they're not, the things that we like to think are what makes some music complicated.
Yeah, exactly. I think that what music production allows us to do on computers is that we can add in all of this stuff, and we can have 200 to 300 tracks per session. Yeah. And that allows us to be really subtle and to just have like this one sound, just add a little bit of an edge to a synthesizer or something like that. And so it's a very subtle kind of thing. And if you can't hear that, if you're not a producer yourself, I can understand why pop music might not be as interesting to you. But if you are, I love listening to pop music for limited amount of time, because for me it's really exhausting, because I hear so many things going on in those songs.
One of my favorite things when I'm listening to pop music is like hearing a line that I never heard before. Like I was listening to some Maroon 5 song, I don't remember which one. It was one of the old ones that I'd listened to like 100 times or something. And like suddenly I'm listening and they get to the chorus, and there's this syncopated guitar line that like I've never heard before. It's like this really tiny little thing in the background, and it's just, but once you hear it and you focus on it and it's there, it's really cool, and it helps like bring the whole thing up another level, but you're not consciously aware of it until you're listening really, really closely.
Yeah, for sure. I love Maroon 5, and I do that too. Like I love listening to old music again. Like POD was something I listened to when I was a teenager. Yes. And listening to that now, I'm like, wow, there's so much stuff going on that I never heard back then that it's just like never realized. Yeah. The thing is, I don't really have anything against musicians' music. And I mean, I love listening to Coltrane or even Debussy or Tool. Those are all favorites of mine. But what I think what these artists manage is to use complexity in their favor to create an emotion. So, Coldplay has a certain rage about him when he's playing all these crazy scales. Debussy sounds kind of drowsy and like washed out because of his harmony. And Tool has that insane vibe about it, especially because of they're more rhythmically interesting, I think, than harmonically interesting, but still. Yeah. So I think no good artist uses music theory just to be out there. I think the greatest writers of all time always strike an emotional chord, literally, and always make your heart beat a little faster in that way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think music theory provides you tools. It provides you ways to do things that you might not have thought of, but it's not a shortcut, and it's not a cheat code. Actually, you mentioned Adele earlier, and it reminded me of when Someone Like You came out. I don't know if you remember this, but there was this string of articles that were published all over the internet that being like, oh my God, Adele has this like secret formula for writing music, and like that makes you really sad, and like there's this code that she knows, and she knows how to do this. And then like I went and read some of the articles, and it was like, use appoggiaturas, write in minor, and have good lyrics. Yeah. And I was like, that's what?
That's ridiculous. Yeah. I get that all the time though. I mean, even like I'm talking about formulas in my videos, like, The Weeknd, for example, using a lot of the fourth scale degree for his melodies. And he just released another song that has the fourth scale degree in his melody. And Taylor Swift just released another song that has the root note or like the one in her melody. Yeah. Exactly. So, there is that to a certain degree, but try it at home. Like, oh, I'm gonna sound like Taylor Swift today by playing the first scale degree. It's just never gonna work. I mean, that's not how it works. It's just, of course, we're using formula, but that's not what matters. What matters is those ideas that you're talking about.
It's what you do with it. Yeah,
exactly. Having a crazy idea and turning it into something that works.
It's the story that formula lets you tell.
Yeah,
like we're not doing math. We're doing art.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm doing math. I love doing math, but that's not what, if I'm making music, I'm not thinking, math. I'm thinking like what sounds good. And I don't do a lot of really complicated stuff. A lot of my stuff is like for a section 3-4 chords, just because I like the way that sounds better. And I can write like a really complex, like 32 bar jazz song progression. I can do that. I've done it, but it's not what I want to do a lot of the times. It's not what the music I want to make needs. So why would I do it? Why would I put it in there if it makes the music I'm making worse? You know?
And what kind of music do you make?
It varies a lot. I mean, I go through phases. Like went through at one point, I was doing like a super like complex like prog metal project thing I was working on. Another time I decided to start doing like horror rock stuff, but for an acoustic guitar. And that I think turned out really cool, although I never really pursued that. I never really made that much. I recorded one song. Actually, I recorded two, but we never actually got around to editing the other one. But and I think it turned out really well, but it was just, that one was like, I think 3 chords for most of it, but just, it was a way of just sort of experimenting with stuff. I mean, that's a lot of what I do when I'm writing, is just sort of trying stuff out to see like I said, I get into sort of phases where I'm like, I'm going to do this song, and then, I like the sound of that, I'm going to try another thing like it. But once I'm done with it, I move on pretty quickly.
Yeah, so, I'm the same. That's why I became a songwriter, not an artist, because I can't really, focus on one thing for too long, I think. So why do you think songwriters write nonsensical songs once they get the theory? Like, I think there are 2 reasons, really. The first being that music theory, as we know it, wasn't invented to write music. I think it was created to analyze already existing music. So if you want to create something cool, I think it's generally a good idea to stay as far away as possible from music theory, or you'll end up writing cheesy chord progressions, like, as in the beginning, especially like 1, 6, 4, 5, like something very dominant based, or, something like that. And the second reason for me is that I think classical music theory is really just that. It's classical. It kind of makes sense when you're analyzing Mozart, but when it comes to Usher and 21 Pilots, I think it's pretty useless.
Well, I think it is and it isn't. I think that fundamentally you can sort of view it. I think you're right that if you just take the theory you use to analyze Beethoven and go, okay, now let's look at Usher, you're not going to get very good results. But if you look at sort of the arc of modern music as it's evolved, it evolved from the music that Beethoven wrote. In a very real way, most modern popular music has sort of descended from that, and some other traditions, from the blues, from other things, but these sorts of things intermingle, and we have a lot of the descendants of that sort of harmony in modern popular music. So we can sort of use those not to tell us what's going on, but to inform our new theories and new analytical techniques that will then help us explain this. Because I think, obviously, we see a lot less dominant resolution stuff. We see more like 4/1 resolutions but like plagal cadences, those are a lot more common these days than they used to be. But we still see dominant resolutions, and we still see like plagal cadence. The plagal cadence still sort of has the same effect that it used to. It has the sort of like weaker resolution sound. And it sort of, I think understanding classical harmony helps you understand modern music, but only if you understand that they're different things. If you approach it as like, this is this theory that I learned to analyze Beethoven, Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to use it on 21 Pilots, you're not going to get anything. You're just going to look at that and be like, well, this makes no sense. There's nothing going on here. Or like, when I did our video analyzing Stairway to Heaven, like you look at the harmony there and you go, okay, this is functionally incoherent. There is no functional harmony going on here as far as I can tell, but it's still built on those ideas, and you can then sort of say, okay, so what is going on? How are they using? How have they evolved this? How have they developed it in other ways? And that lets you understand sort of where they're coming from, because they are reacting to that sort of music, even if they're not playing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and sure. I think, rock and roll music or pop music in general, I think even in the beginning was kind of a counter movement to classical music, which was getting more and more complex. And pop music set out to do something different, to get simpler and simpler, to kind of figure out how to make it as simple as possible. It's more of a marketing thing, obviously, as well. I think it was there to make money as well. So I think that also helps to kind of figure out what is it exactly that drives people to buy something and to move or whatever. What
are the important parts? What actually moves people, instead of what can we do cool math to?
Exactly. I have this theory, and I'd love to share it with you and hear what you think about it. Where I think about harmony in terms of vertical against horizontal. Vertical, I'm thinking about a chord if I write it just about the sound, and I'm thinking about the scales that go over it and just the color of that chord. And the other way is the horizontal way, the storytelling way, where we're going somewhere, right? So I'm playing a 5 because it is going to have a resolution to a tonic sound. And so those are kind of two different approaches, I think, to harmony. And they can work together, but what I've noticed, what I'm noticing more and more is when we have a 5/1 in pop music now, it tends to be the first way, the vertical way, in that we have longer 5 chords. So instead of having quick changes, which underlines the voice leading, underlines the horizontal approach, the storytelling approach, which is all about tension resolution. We now have longer chords, so we can taste that chord for a little bit longer and just feel all the different intervals against that chord, and we get more of a colorful vertical effect.
Sort of creating an acoustic emotional landscape instead of sort of a long just a chain of events.
So that's kind of what I've been noticing, is that we're moving away, we already have moved away from horizontal harmony writing, and we're moving more and more towards the vertical writing, where it's more about getting a feel for every single chord along the way. And I'd love to hear you think about this. Have you noticed something like this as well?
Let's see. I definitely agree with you that we don't tend to have those sort of super fast jazz changes anymore, where you change chords twice a bar and you're playing at 240 beats per minute, and so basically you have, I don't feel like doing the math, but a bunch of chords per second. But we have more time to absorb any given chord. And I think that comes back again to the simplicity thing that you were talking about, where it's just trying to track a bunch of different chords at once isn't necessarily the most effective way to engage your listener. And so if you can give them one chord and then show them what that chord feels like, what notes feel like over that chord, and then move on to the next one, I think that's it. Probably a more effective tool, and especially in pop music, where you are trying to tell a story, you're trying to paint a picture, you're not trying to show off for the most part, except I don't know, I think in pop music you often see vocalists showing off, but they're in terms of composition you don't really see a lot of that. It's more about, again, simplicity and about telling that story. And so I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that sort of slowing things down, but now that I think about it, I think you're definitely right. I think that that's definitely been a trend, and that we are probably moving towards that because it's simpler and because it's easier to do. Mm-hmm. So
like bite-sized chords, where we get just one chord at a time, and we have a lot of time to chew and swallow it and kind of understand what we're hearing before we move on to the next chord. And that being said, we already hear the same chord progressions over and over again in different pop songs. So I think we're so used to the chords that we can now just focus on the melody and the rhythm of it, I think.
And the arrangement and all that. So
and
the lyrics, of course.
Oh, of course. So I'd love to know, how do you use music theory in your own compositions? And, what do you use it for? Do you use it in harmony or voicings, or do you use it for melodies, rhythm?
So the way I think about it is that music theory is a way of filling the gaps between inspirations. So I may have a melody in my head that I think sounds really good, and I sort of transcribe it, but I don't have chords in my head yet, and I can sort of look at it and be like, okay, what progression would work with this? Or I might have like a cool arpeggiation pattern, and I can sort of find a progression that works with that, or I might have a progression, and then I sort of know how to write a melody over it, or I know how to add rhythm, or whatever. So it's a way of sort of, there's not like one specific aspect of music that I use it for, though I probably use it for harmony more than other things, just because it's an easy way to write a chord progression, and it can be hard to write a good chord progression otherwise for me. But just sort of having a way to say, okay, I've got this cool idea in my head. How do I quickly take it from an idea to a song? How do I minimize the distance between, oh, I thought of something cool, and oh, I have now produced something cool? And of course you can always go back and change it and come be like, oh, I don't like this 4 minor here. I think it could be a 4 major, and that might sound cool. You can sort of go tweak it afterwards, but it's a quick way to sort of get at least a demo of what the single piece of inspiration that you might have had could be if it was a complete song. Is sort of how I tend to think about it.
That's really interesting, because I hear that quite a lot, that people use music theory to find chords to their melodies. And I've never done that, because I started learning how to write songs without music theory completely. The first couple of 5 years or so, I just didn't know any music theory at all. And I'd love to know how you do that. I mean, is it just like, so you look at the notes in the melody in that bar, and you look at, okay, so for example, that could be a 3rd in a 4 chord, and then the next note could be the 7 in that 4 chord, or I could turn that into the 1 and 3 of the 2 or whatever. Is that how you look at it, or how?
Well, part of it is that, but also I sort of have sort of a library of chord progressions in my head. And just sort of not necessarily just like 1 6 4 5 or something, but I know sort of, like 1 flat 3 flat 7 flat 6 or something, or whatever. And I know what sets of things might sound good or might sound bad, and I can quickly sort of look at a thing and just go, okay, why don't I try this? This seems like it might work, and I can give it a shot. And if it doesn't, I can switch chords around. But it's a combination of, like I said, just sort of knowing which notes could work with which chords, and knowing just which chords work with each other, and just sort of trying to line those two things up, if that makes sense. Gotcha.
So for you, it's more like figuring out in which key the melody is, and then, knowing a lot of chord progressions within that key, and just trying out a lot of them. Like, it's a lot of experimentation still.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of trying out a lot of them, but also, you can sort of quickly look at certain things and be like, okay, so this in the melody I'm singing, I have the leading tone, so I'm probably not going to play the 1 chord there unless I want to use 7th chords, but that's probably not going to sound good. Or like, here I have the 3rd degree in the melody, so I probably shouldn't play like a 4 chord unless, again, I want to use 7ths. And you can sort of look at that and say, like, quickly narrow down that set of possible chord progressions into a set of actual ones that work with the melody.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's how I kind of use it as well. Like, when I find chords to my melodies, try to keep the theory out of it, kind of, because I want to make it about the emotion that I get with the melody. So for me, it's also a lot of experimentation, and I'll just keep singing the melody and just try out different chords against different bars. Yeah. And, just one will usually stick where I'm like, oh yeah, this chord sounds really nice against this. And then it's just a lot of playing around, trying out different bass notes, and then trying out, okay, so I got the bass notes. Now, next thing is it major or minor? Figuring that stuff out. So that's how I kind of slowly approach my finished chord progression usually.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally, like, you can't... if you want to make music to be listened to and enjoyed, you have to listen to your music while you're writing it. You have to experiment. You have to try different things. You can't just... unless I'm trying to just write a thing mathematically for fun, which I do sometimes. I'm not going to say I don't do that. But if... I don't necessarily then take those and expect everyone else to appreciate listening to them, because I just like them structurally. I don't even necessarily enjoy listening to them. But if I want to make something that I think other people might want to listen to, and that I might want to listen to, that I think sounds good, I'm always going to be experimenting. I'm always going to be like, let's try this, see how it works, see what happens. And that's one of the reasons that actually a lot of my composition I do in MIDI, which is digital instruments. Because it's very easy to sort of program something up and then go change a small thing and see how that changes things, and you can quickly change it back, and you don't have to remember everything you did. You just have a record of it, and you can do very complex arrangements that I can't just orchestrate an entire string section for fun. Like would have to pay a string section or find like 5 friends or whatever who want to play strings for me. But like I can just put some notes on a piano roll and my MIDI program will play strings for me. So I found that really helpful for writing in that sort of experimentation sense as well, is just I can go quickly change whatever I want. And that's been really helpful for me as a composer as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I learned all of this in Guitar Pro 4 back in the day.
Yeah.
That's been so helpful because, I mean, the way I learned songwriting was I could experiment with MIDI all week, and then every Thursday we would meet up for band rehearsal and band practice, and would get together and I'd see what worked and what didn't really work, because some things do work in MIDI, but they don't work in the real world, and the other way around as well, of course. So, but yeah, MIDI is so helpful, especially when you're trying to learn how to arrange, because you're not limited to just one instrument, the one you're playing, but you can try out, writing for all the different instruments. And it's so helpful when in band practice you can say like, hey, can you play a little bit less hi-hat there and just play on the offbeats or something like that? If you know how the different instruments work, it definitely helps a ton. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned music theory filling in the gaps for you in terms of inspiration. And let me ask you then, what in music theory do you find inspiring?
So a lot of what I really enjoy and what inspires me is analyzing specific songs, like looking at like what someone else did to accomplish a specific effect. Like, to use an example, like I said, we recently did a video analyzing Comfortably Numb, and anyone listening to Comfortably Numb can tell that there's a huge difference between the verse and the chorus, and just sort of diving in and trying to figure out what that was. And it's like, okay, so they're moving from minor to major, which is, it's an obvious thing, and it's the relative major, so it's similar, related, but not quite the same thing. But that's a clear tonal shift, and you can see that. But also, if you dig into it, they have this thing where in the chorus, they have very strong functional harmony. It's like 1-5-1-5. Whereas if you go to the verse, they have very, very clear non-functional harmony. Like, they just sort of walk down the scale, but they skip the 5 to avoid any sense of resolution. So it's like 1 minor, flat 7, flat 6, 4 minor. And the bass walks past the 5. And so there's this really clear and unambiguous effort to not play functional harmony in the verse and then to play it really, really clearly in the chorus. And I would never have thought of that. And so that sort of thing, like seeing someone do something really cool with music, and especially with harmony, like I said, I don't want to give the impression that harmonic analysis is all music theory is, because it's much more complicated than that. But I'm sort of a harmonic analysis specialist. That's what I really like doing. That's what I spend most of my time doing when I have the option. That's what I find the most inspiring and the most interesting and the most fun. And so just sort of seeing how someone used chords in a way that I might not have thought of is, I think, probably the most inspiring. And I might not necessarily use that exact trick, but it sort of gives me something like a new way to approach music that I wouldn't have thought of, and I can sort of file away in that toolbox, that library of possible ideas, and pull back out if I need it.
Cool.
So that's, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I find that really interesting because, of course, you can't steal chord progressions from other people and just use them in your own songs because they're not copyright protected. And so that's always a great way of getting inspired, I think, by other music. But I think I'm just trying to figure out new ways to use harmony that is not so obvious or like so classical, because when I write 5/1s in my own music, I always think it sounds boring, and I never really find any interest in that unless I find like a really cool voicing for the 5/1 or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, I try to really steer away from that, and kind of the chord progressions that end on 4/5/1 are kind of gone from my mind. I try to steer away from those as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, they have their place, but I agree that in a lot of cases, it feels old fashioned.
So do you ever go to other songs for their interesting meters or specific rhythmic fragments and use them in your own songs? Do you ever try to do that?
I'm not sure I borrow them very much. I will sort of invent my own. I drum a lot. I don't drum. I'm not a drummer. But I drum just to myself as just like tapping on my like leg or something, and just sort of I'll often mess around with that and find rhythms I like that way, just absent-mindedly while I'm doing something else. And then I'll sort of take that and be like, okay, what can I do with that? And then sort of turn it into like a riff or turn it into something. And that's all actually how I got into, back when I was doing like my super complex prog stuff, was I was just sort of sitting around one day and just tapping on my legs. And it turned out that what I was tapping was in 1916, the time signature, not the year. And so I sort of figured that out and wrote a riff based on that. And then wound up writing a song with 6 different time signatures and poly-accented stuff. It was a nightmare, but I like the way it sounded.
I always find it really fascinating when I hear a band that uses like an odd meter, like Tool, for example, or, you know, as you said, a 1916. I always find that really fascinating when I hear it, and I'm just like, that sounds weird and tense and interesting. And then I'm like, why is that? And I figure out that it's because of the meter. That always like, I love that feeling when I'm like, this gives me a very specific emotion, like first, and then I see what it is, and I'm like, oh wow, this is something quite complex. Like this is something that someone actually had to sit down with and like arrange this out for an entire band. Because, you know, coming up with a guitar riff in 1916 is one thing, but, you know, arranging it out for an entire band and just making sure that everyone has their thing to play and that it grooves together, that's an entirely different ball game. So
that's always the hardest thing with, you know, with complex meter stuff, is just, you know, you might have like a cool riff in 1916 and you might have parts for everyone in 1916, but then how do you move on? How do you go to another section? Like, do you play another riff in the same time signature? Do you write a new one? How do you make that transition smooth?
Oh yeah.
How do you get it to feel connected and not just like you're jumping to a random place?
Yeah.
That I think was the hardest and most interesting part of that challenge, was trying to make it work in a way that felt organic, even though, you know, I was jumping from like 1916 to 1516 to 1416, which, you know, I could have called 7/8, but I didn't, and then back to like 1716, and it was how to make those transitions feel organic instead of feeling like me being like, and here's another time signature.
Yeah.
And that was,
I know exactly what you mean. I had exactly those same problems when I had my prog rock phase. And I know exactly what you mean. But listening to some of the biggest bands out there that use different time signatures, even like, because I'm thinking of Tool and Meshuggah and those kinds of bands.
Yeah.
Even them, you know, even in the choruses, they usually jump back to 4/4 or 6/4 or something a lot more standard to like deliver like a punch in the chorus. And then for the verse or for the post chorus, when they go back to like a riff based kind of writing, then they're going like crazy with their time signatures.
Sort of relax musically instead of...
Exactly. It's like it's a tension resolution thing, because playing something in 1916 is always going to sound tense in a way. I mean, there are certain time signatures that I think can sound really relaxing, like 5/4, for example. But 1916 is probably very difficult to pull off, that it sounds relaxing and powerful.
Yeah, sort of, I think, broke that up with a bit of 15/16 that I subdivided into groups of 3/16 each. So it sort of gave you at least something that was consistent, even though it was still a little weird. It was like 5/4 with triplets.
Yeah.
But, you know, at least it sort of gave you something where for a little bit you could feel a pulse, and it stayed the pulse for a reasonable amount of time. Yeah. And so,
yeah, I think it's important that if you write in odd time signatures to give the audience a lot of it, like for over an extended period of time, so that they can get into it at least a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So anything else in music theory you find inspiring? Some stuff that you draw inspiration from?
One thing that I really enjoy, and I don't use a lot in my actual art or music that I make for practical reasons, but I really, really like reading about and learning about tuning systems. And just sort of the math behind that. Because if you look at, say, like if you look at modern tuning, we have 12-tone equal temperament, where, you know, every half step is the same distance. It's, you know, if you play in C major and then you play in D major, the only difference is the starting note. There's no actual difference in the distances between those notes. Whereas if you look back before, I think it was like the 18th century or so, that we really settled on equal temperament. But if you look back before then, there's all sorts of different systems that we're trying to solve different problems. And like my favorite, actually one of my favorites is Pythagorean tuning, which is really old. It's, it's named after Pythagoras.
Yeah.
Although I don't know for sure if we actually know that he actually invented it. I'm not sure. But it's basically, because like a perfect fifth is supposed to be an exactly 3-to-2 frequency ratio. But in the way we use it, equal temperament, it's actually, I think it's a little flat.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you should Google Terry Riley, and Burial, I think, also experiments with that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And it's, gives you just a really interesting sound. I think it definitely sets you apart from everyone else because you are sounding very unique that way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to end this episode with a question that I got from one of my students via email that I actually already answered, but I'd love to hear your input on it because this is a question I get quite a lot. And I think maybe we could expand it a little bit. So the question was, if I want to be a songwriter, do I need to be able to sing? And I think we could maybe expand it to, if I'm starting out, what's useful? Should I learn music theory? Should I learn an instrument? If so, which one? Should I learn how to produce? Should I start playing in a band, learn to sing? What do you think a starter, someone who's just starting writing songs, should start with?
So I think that probably the best thing to do is to learn to play an instrument, which could involve singing. I tend to think that harmonic instruments are more valuable than melodic from a compositional standpoint, just because you can play melodies on a harmonic instrument like a piano or a guitar or something, but you can't play chords on a trumpet.
Exactly.
And so learning to play piano, learning to play guitar, whatever, lets you think both melodically and harmonically. And whereas learning to play trumpet, saxophone, oboe, whatever, actually violin, you can play chords. That was a bad example. But like learning to play an instrument that only plays one note at a time is, I think, helps you think melodically, but doesn't necessarily help you think harmonically. And I think they're both important. And to go to specifically to learning to sing, because I'm primarily trained as a singer. That's what my degree is in, although I don't do it too much anymore. I much more do composing and theory and stuff. But my degree is in vocal performance. And I think that it is valuable, but I want to break it into two different parts, because there's learning how to sing technically, which is like vocal technique, learning how to produce a note and how to have good tone and how to hit high notes and all that stuff. But there's also learning what to sing, learning how to hit notes, learning what notes would sound good there. And I think voice is a really useful instrument for that second part because it's instinctive in a way that most instruments aren't. It lets you separate the composition aspect from the transcription aspect. So if I have a cool melody in my head and I want to play it on guitar, I need to know what the notes are. I need to know it's A and then C and then B and then C again and then G sharp or whatever it is. I need to know what those notes are or I can't play them. Whereas with singing, I can just sing a melody that I hear in my head, and as long as I have a decent ability to match pitch, I can sort of record myself singing, and then I can go transcribe it. I can go do something else. I don't have to know what it is before I can produce it in the real world. And I think that that's one of the things that singing brings to the table, especially at the beginning, because, a really high-level pianist, like actually a really high-level keyboardist can translate that in a way that they may not be consciously thinking, okay, now I need to play a C sharp. Their hand goes there because they're so used to that being the motion they make when they want to make that sound. But if you're just starting out, you don't have those instincts, and singing is a quick shortcut to that. And so I think in that sense, singing is valuable. I wouldn't say you need it, but I think it is a useful thing to have for that reason.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. It's funny that you picked out those two because those would be my two picks as well. I think the quickest way to learn an instrument is playing in a band. So I always recommend you start playing in a band just because you get the practice that way and you kind of have to practice certain songs. So that kind of forces you to like really get behind it. And also my two picks would be piano and guitar. I sometimes, get annoyed when because I'm definitely a guitarist by trade. I'm a terrible pianist, and sometimes I wish I just was a better pianist, just because so much of the production environment centers around the piano or the MIDI keyboard. That I'd love to be able to play more complex harmony with my two hands, but what usually comes out is just like a bass line on the left and maybe a melody on the right if I'm lucky, which is the modern pop sound. But I spend a lot more time programming within Logic than I really really should be. I mean, I should be playing all of this stuff live, but you know, I have to like correct a lot manually later on. So I sometimes I get really angry at myself for not learning how to play piano properly. And the other one, learning to sing. I don't think you have to be an amazing singer to be a good songwriter, but I personally do think that if you want to be a good top liner, so in other words, you want to be able to write good melodies, then being able to sing is worth so much. And it's, you wouldn't think that's necessarily true because you're like, oh, I can write for piano and don't have to be a pianist. But for vocals, since vocals are so important, especially in pop music, it's like what everything revolves around. And in, you know, the biggest trade and the biggest money in the pop world lies in top lining, right? That's where all the money is. If you ever want to make money writing songs, being a top liner is so much more valuable than just being someone who can write good music. And what I've noticed is that people who can't really sing are usually bad top liners. So I'm not a great singer myself, but I can sing and I can hit the right pitch, and I, you know, can sing in falsetto and in head voice and stuff like that. So for me, it's easy to write melodies like that. And I sing everything. I mean, I even sing my piano lines, I sing my bass lines, everything, because I find if you do that, your music starts to breathe, because you actually have to breathe. You know, you have to have a moment where you're like, you know, take a breath, and that helps you in your writing as well, because it doesn't feel so full. Like the arrangement just gets a lot clearer if you have those short pauses. So for example, I was writing a song the other day, producing a song, and for the bass, it turned out that it wasn't a good idea to just have like whole notes, but the best approach, like the one that just made it bounce a little bit more, that made it like danceable, was to have it just a little bit shorter than a whole note. So it wasn't really a specific note value, it was just like a few like ticks shorter than a complete whole note, and that just kind of made the whole thing a lot more bouncy, and it just made you want to dance. And it's a big difference hearing that and complete whole note. And I think the difference really is the breath, and breath is so important for pop music because it really does make everything a lot more bouncy.
Yeah. And there's one thing that I want to mention that wasn't on your list, but that I think is really, really probably the most important thing you can do, which is ear training. And it's not necessarily the most fun thing you can do, but like if you hear a note in your head and you like can't figure out what that note is, or if you hear a chord and you can't figure out what the root of that chord is.
Can't believe I forgot that. Yeah.
It can get a bit tedious, but it's really, really, really rewarding. I think that it makes you so much better at not only just writing, but also appreciating music, at listening to music, at like hearing things that you may not have heard. And that, well, again, you know, like we were talking about before, like you can listen to someone else's song, hear something they're doing and go, oh, I want to do that. And then you have a new tool, but you can't get that tool unless you can figure out what they're doing.
Exactly.
I think that is the most important thing that any musician who wants to be serious about music can do, is get a better ear. And you never get to a point, I don't think, where your ear is like, okay, this is good, I'm done. It's always worth practicing more, getting a better ear, and because that just pays so many dividends down the road.
That's so true. I can't believe that was not on the list, because that's actually the one thing I always tell beginning songwriters actually is start listening. You know, you really have to listen to what other people are doing to like kind of figure out how this whole thing works, because learning it all yourself is, you know, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Like when I listen to music, I listen very differently than you probably, and probably all of the people that are listening, because we all have our things that we're picking up upon. And for me, that's usually melody, which is why my artist series revolves around melodies and, you know, scale degrees that artists tend to use a lot. And yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I think every songwriter should buy themselves is not a sequencer, it's not a computer, it's not headphones, it's earplugs. Because if your ears are gone, then you're really in trouble. Yeah.
No, I these days I don't go to too many loud shows. I've gotten sort of to the point where that's not a huge part of my musical experience. But like when I do, I have to have earplugs. Like that was a habit I picked up in college. Like I started when I was like, I'm a rock guy, I can listen to all sorts of loud music and it'll be great, and I love the volume, and then like halfway through, like I started using, because they just had like a free earplug dispenser in the concert hall, because, you know, like everyone there wanted earplugs, and so I was just start grabbing those and putting those in. It's like, oh, this is just better. Like I walk away, my ears aren't ringing. Like, I can still hear everything, and I can hear things more clearly because they're not like, my brain's not trying to compensate for everything being too loud. This is just a better experience. And yeah, I highly recommend protecting your ears, even if you're not a musician, honestly. Like, at this point with medical technology where it is, your hearing doesn't come back once it goes away. So like, maybe one day they'll figure out how to fix that, but for now, your ears are what you've got. And if you lose them, you lose them. So yeah, take care of them.
I think those are some wise words to end with, because that's something I think everyone should take to heart. And I mean, thank you so much for doing this with me. It was a lot of fun. I learned some stuff, and I hope we can do this in the future, because there's so much stuff we haven't covered yet. As you guys can hear, Corey knows a lot about music theory, and
Well, I wouldn't say a lot.
well, I would say you do. So I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more in future episodes if you'd like to come back. So cool. Thanks for doing this with me, and everyone. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to do more like this one, hopefully. And goodbye.
Cool. All right. Take care.